And Sa'd radiallahu anhu left with 32,000 Muslims to face the superpower of the day. And they camped in a place called Qadisiyah. And Rustam, who was the second in charge of the Persians, the Dick Cheney of his day, he sent a message to Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu anhu, and he said, send me a man that I can speak to. And Sa'd radiallahu anhu sent a man that if this incident had not happened, it is a strong possibility that we would have never heard his name. He was a Sahabi called Rabi ibn Amir radiallahu anhu. Rabi radiallahu anhu was a Sahabi who had spent his entire life in bondage. He had been a slave all his life. He was an Abyssinian slave. And Rabi radiallahu anhu left the camp of the Muslims on a small mule. And when he reached the camp of the Persians, they said, descend from your mule. And Rabi radiallahu anhu said, you requested me to come. Now you will accept my conditions. I will not descend. And the narrations mention that the tent of the Persian was embellished like never before. It had silk lining all the way through, and they had pillows which had silk and gold lining upon it. Why? Because they thought that when this Bedouin, he would see the opulence and the grandeur, he would capitulate, he would be overawed. But not for a moment was Rabi affected by this glamour and this opulence. Why? Because Rabi radiallahu anhu understood that the treasure that he had was the treasure of Iman, and this was an eternal treasure. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, Alhamdulillahi ala ni'mat al-Islam wa kafa biha ni'mah. All praise be to Allah upon the ni'mah of Islam. And if this was the only ni'mah that man was given, it would suffice. And he understood that the treasure that they had was the treasure of the dunya, and the dunya was transient, it was short-lived, and not for a moment was he affected, influenced by the glamour and the glitter which was around him. And the narrations mention that Rabi was riding a small mule. He had tatty clothes on which had patches upon it, and he had a sword, and the sheath of the sword was made out of cloth. And when he entered the court of Rustam, who was sitting on a huge bed and he had a crown upon his head, Rustam's cronies, when they saw Rabi radiallahu anhu, they began to laugh. They began to laugh. Why? Because they judged him by his apparent. But little did they know that underneath those tatty clothes and that dark skin lay characteristics for which Allah defined him as radiyallahu anhum wa radu an, that Allah is pleased with them and they are pleased with Allah. Allah is pleased with them and they are pleased with Allah. And the narrations mention that Rabi radiallahu anhu, he reached the bed of Rustam, he got off his mount, and he struck one of the pillows with his sword. And he made a hole in the pillow, and he tied his mule. And then they had placed a huge pillow for him to sit on. And he struck that with a spear, and he removed it, and he sat on the floor. And Rustam said, why did you do that for? What made you do that? And he said, I do not wish to sit on the dunya that you present me. I prefer to sit on the floor. And then Rustam asked him, he said, مَا الَّذِي جَاءَ بِكُمْ? He said, what brought you people? Because even Rustam knew that these weren't your normal conquerors. There was something different about these people. And he said, مَا الَّذِي جَاءَ بِكُمْ? He said, what brought you? And listen to the words of Rabi radiallahu anhu, because they are a lesson for me and you. He didn't say that Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas sent us. He didn't say that Umar ibn Khattab sent us. He didn't even say that this was a mission of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But he said, Wallahu ta'afana. He said, Allah sent us. He said, our duty is from Allah. Allah ta'afana لنخرج من شاء من عباده من عبادة العباد إلى عبادة رب العباد وجور الأديان إلى عدل الإسلام وضيق الدنيا إلى سعة الآخرة. He said, Allah sent us to remove whoever He wishes from the servitude of man to the servitude of the Lord of man, and from the unjust nature of other religions and systems to the justice of Islam, and from the tight confinement of this dunya to the vast expansion of the hereafter. This is why Allah has sent us. Allah has sent us to remove whoever He wishes from the servitude of man to the servitude of the Lord of man. And nobody understood this better than Rabi, for he was a man who had spent his entire life in bondage, entire life in slavery, entire life in serving other people. And when he embraced Islam, he was emancipated and he became the slave of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he said, Allah has sent us to remove whoever He wants from the servitude of man to the servitude of the Lord of man, and from the unjust nature of other religions and systems to the justice of Islam. And then he said, from the tight confinement of this dunya to the vast expansion of the hereafter. See, as long as you follow some other system, you will be serving some other person, that system. And therefore your scope will be limited to this dunya. There you will die and the only thing you will attain is this dunya. Whilst if you follow the justice of Islam, then you will become the slave of Allah. And when you become the slave of Allah and you die, for you is the vast expansion of the hereafter. And then Rabi radiallahu anhu said to Rustam, he said, if you accept what we have brought, then we will go back. But if you refuse, then we will fight you until we reach the promise of Allah. If you accept, then we will go back. And it shows that these people weren't interested in conquering other people. All they were concerned was spreading justice. That's all they were concerned. And this is why they're saying, if you accept, then we will go back. But if you refuse, then we will fight you. Why? Because the Persians were known for their tyranny. When the Persians took over Yemen and the Abyssinian Christians ruled Yemen, the narrations mention that the Abyssinians rebelled. And what the Persians did is that any person who had a drop of Abyssinian blood in him, they killed him. The narrations mention that they would slit the stomach of the women and they would rip their children out. This is how barbaric they were. And then Rustam said to Rabi radiallahu anhu, he said, you say, if I refuse, you will fight me until you reach the promise of Allah. Tell me, what is this promise of Allah? Subhanallah. Rabi said, the promise of Allah is Jannah for those who die fighting, and victory for those who remain behind. Jannah for those who die fighting, and victory for those who remain behind. And then Rustam asked him, he said, tell me, are you their leader? And Rabi radiallahu anhu said, no, I'm not their leader. I am the lowest from amongst them. But the believers are like one body. The believers are like one body. The high assists the low, and the low assists the high. And he was expounding upon the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Al-mu'minuna ka-jasadin wahid," that the believers are like one body. If the head hurts, the entire body feels a source of discomfort, and if the eyes hurt, the entire body feels uneasy. And then Rustam, he went back to his cronies and he had a council with them, and he said, have you ever seen a man who is more articulate and more confident than this man? Who was he speaking about? He was speaking about Rabi radiallahu anhu, who had spent his entire life in bondage. He had no PhD from Harvard, but he was man who Allah loved. And the Prophet ﷺ said, when Allah loves a person, then he becomes the ears by which he listens. He becomes the eyes by which he sees. He becomes the mouth by which he speaks. He becomes the hand by which he grasps. He becomes the feet by which he walks. And when then this happens, when you become one with Allah, then nothing can defeat you. Nothing can overpower you. And this was the state that these people had reached. And Rustam, he wanted to broker a deal with the Muslims, because Rustam had seen a dream that the angel had descended and they had taken the weapon from the hand of the Persians and he had given it to the Muslims. and he wanted to broker a deal, but his men around him insisted upon fighting.